turned down, maybe. There we go. The music's always funny. Anyway, welcome, folks, to another edition of Liberty Unbridled. I'm your host, Ken Molden, and this is the My View Matters radio network. Tonight we're going to talk about Obamacare, and specifically Obamacare in Kentucky. We'll be talking here in just a few minutes with David Adams. He's been very much in touch with this issue here in Kentucky. In fact, has a couple of lawsuits going as Kentucky's in regard to how Kentucky implemented their exchange, and so we'll talk to him to get an update on where things are with the lawsuits. But as always, to get things kind of started here, we start with the random political rhetoric generator. Tonight's randomly generated political rhetoric is: my opponent is taking donations from Somali pirates, Chinese factory workers, and drug addicts. Always have to laugh at the political rhetoric generator. It's always entertaining. Looks like we have David on the line, so I'm just going to go ahead and bring him on. And that's probably the best thing to do. David, welcome to the show.
Hey, Ken.
Hey, thanks for coming on. We've had a handful of requests, a handful of different topics that people often request of us, and definitely one of the top ones, if not the top issue, is the Obamacare issue. So certainly appreciate you coming on. And I guess if you could give a brief, short history of where you're at with this issue. I mentioned at the very beginning that you've got a couple of lawsuits going in regard to Obamacare here in Kentucky.
Yes. When it comes to implementation of Obamacare from the federal legislation that we all are familiar with, the states have two main options. They have the option to decide to set up their own exchange, and what they get in exchange for doing that is a big mouthful of federal dollars up front, and then at the end of calendar year 2014, those federal funds all run out, and it becomes the state's responsibility to pay for all the costs of the exchange, the health benefit exchange, they call it. The other half of the equation is the Medicaid expansion, which when they originally wrote the Affordable Care Act, they made it mandatory. And the U.S. Supreme Court, by a vote of 7-2, said, no, you can't require the states to expand Medicaid. It has to be an option. And there's a process for doing both of these things. And I noticed when we were getting started, when Kentucky started looking at Obamacare, that we broke state law implementing the exchange, and then broke it again implementing the Medicaid expansion. And so I filed two lawsuits. Those are in the process. We've had several hearings, and now we're awaiting the Kentucky Supreme Court to have us in to resolve these issues. But at least to my mind, and to just a clear reading of the of state statute, we haven't followed the law on either setting up the exchange or accepting the Medicaid expansion. Meanwhile, the legislature could somewhat make the issue. They could somewhat clarify the issue by putting funding in the budget and authority in some form of legislation for the Medicaid expansion and the creation of the exchange. And they just now hitting the news. In fact, hitting the news that Rupp Arena is not getting their funding, but so far I haven't seen any of the reporters pick up on the fact that the Budget Conference Committee defunded Obamacare.
And so I want to rewind just a hair. I just want to rewind a hair here. When you say that the governor overstepped his bounds in setting up the exchange, or the state did, what you're speaking of is that the governor basically through executive order both expanded Medicaid and created the exchange. And that
there's a bit of a distinction there. He did an executive order for the exchange, and it wasn't by executive order; it was by an administrative function that was simply just done incorrectly to do the Medicaid expansion.
Okay.
He waited too long.
Okay. So essentially what that means, though, is that, and as you mentioned, the funding that he's been receiving to run this from the federal government is going to run out at the end of this year. And the state legislature has effectively said, no, we're not going to continue to fund this past, or at all, I guess, not past anything. We're not going to fund it at all. So essentially that kind of puts the governor and the executive branch in a bit of a bind because they've now created this system, and they've got people signing up. They'll always try to tout how many people they have signed up, and you and I can talk about that in a moment. But now we're going to be looking at the end of this year at a system that has no further funding, no mechanism by which to continue. And that's on top of the legal issues of whether there was the right to set these things up at all.
Right.
So the question then is, so they did officially then take this out of the budget. So that is there any chance they might try to sneak it back in or try to put it in somewhere else, or is it dead?
Well, it's. I want to give a nuance. The answer, in order to be accurate, is a little bit nuanced. Not completely dead, but at least part of it can't be legitimately reintroduced. Now, what I mean by that is the executive order that actually created the Kentucky Health Benefit Exchange actually expired last June. So what happened was that Beshear, at that point, illegally reintroduced an executive order to create the exchange. And so there's some effort that has failed so far to legitimize that executive order or to ratify that executive order. But even if they were able to do that, they're ratifying an executive order that was out of order to begin with. So, to my mind, at least, and I think that any clear-headed reading of statute would find that there's no possible way that we can create the state-run benefit exchange, and go forward with that. It's a little bit more murky when you look at the Medicaid expansion, but to my mind and my reading of statute there, that's a dead issue as well. Now they can throw money at either one of them, but in terms of legal authority, it really is just about, by any reading of it, a moot point. But the legislature coming in and writing specific language saying there will be no state funding of Obamacare at all puts a serious dent in it. And now the governor can come in and strike that language. He has the right to do that. But then you've got a really hot political issue when it comes to the legislature's coming back and overriding his vetoes.
And I guess the question, or not a question, but touching on this issue about the reissuing of the executive order, I have a real concern on that front, kind of outside Obamacare, but I think it obviously is being shown here. If the governor were allowed to just reissue executive orders over and over and over, wouldn't that give the governor the authority to create any law without any check and balance and just keep reissuing it over and over?
That's a fantastic question, and it really is the question at the heart of this whole thing. That whether you like Obamacare or not, whether you like the governor or not, or any governor or not, we have a process. It's in statute. You can look it up. KRS 12.028, and I'll repeat that again. I'll mention it again as we go forward. But KRS 12.028 is the statute that describes how the governor can issue temporary reorganization statutes, and then what has to happen with regard to those statutes going forward in order for its provisions to be implemented into permanent law. Now, what he's allowed to do with this temporary reorganization power is to come in when the legislature is not in session and create new bureaucracies and or write new laws and or create new taxes. But then clearly in the law, the legislature must come in and immediately upon them coming back into General Assembly session, they must ratify the executive order. If they do not, it expires 90 days after the session ends, and anything created in that executive order goes away as if it never happened. That's what happened in 2012. Deere wrote the first exchange executive order. It expired at the end of 2013 General Assembly session, and the day that it expired, I had him in court. We were in court that day, and they walked up to the judge and said, "Oh yeah, by the way, we just reissued this executive order." Well, Section 5 of that statute clearly denies the governor the right to do that, and says that any attempt to reissue the provisions of an executive order without going around the legislature, such as he's trying to do, is not legitimate.
And I think it's really important for people to understand, and especially those that are in favor of Obamacare. You have to be very careful about winning at any cost, because that cost can be very high. In the future, if this is allowed to stand, what we're basically creating is a mini dictator that can just start doing whatever he or she wants to do, and then it would be up to the General Assembly to have to specifically undo those things. And even then, there's nothing that would stop the governor from just reissuing a new executive order that puts it right back into place. So you're basically rendering moot the legislative process completely. And so, apply it to other situations. Pick your issue you're against and apply it to some future time where a future governor is for that issue, and rather than going through the legislative process, he or she just applies it and makes it so. And that's a very, very dangerous thing that, whether you support this particular issue or not, that is setting a very, very dangerous precedent.
So I'm glad that you put that description on it, because I was going to pick a nit with your initial description as a mini dictatorship. It's really, I wouldn't qualify it at all. It's an absolute dictatorship. That's what we're doing when we're allowing when we allow a president with his pen and his cell phone, so to speak, or I guess those were Obama's exact words. You're allowing the governor of the state of Kentucky to just operate unilaterally in direct contradiction of state law and the tenets of a constitutional republic.
Yeah, and I guess that's a really big thing. So is that at the crux of both of your lawsuits? I mean, is that or is that one or the other? Where does this issue particularly play in your lawsuits?
KRS 12.028 is at the heart of the exchange lawsuit. It's distinct in the Medicaid expansion lawsuit. There's a different set of statutes. It's actually KRS 205.520, a Medicaid statute that basically states that we're in favor, the Commonwealth is in favor of going after federal Medicaid dollars wherever we can get them. And so I've challenged the constitutionality of that idea that we, and the analogy I used in court was that we're like a drug addict at that point, and the legislature is the drug dealer, and we're just the drug dealer always says yes to the transaction. He's always pushing more and more, and that's bad policy, and if that doesn't bear out as a good idea, and certainly not a practice that we want to follow under Kentucky's Constitution, or in the alternative, that that it wasn't implemented correctly, and that actually happened. That we have an administrative process that carried out. It's little more than a rubber stamp. That when they do something through administrative review, and you've seen that happen here a couple of times, in particular with the Common Core issue, when they had to vote on the science standards and actually voted it down, and Bashir said, well, I'm going to go ahead and do it anyway. He's actually allowed to do that under state law, under KRS 13A. But there are timing issues that have to be met in order for those administrative regulations to be implemented properly, and he just botched it. He started too late on the Medicaid expansion.
And if I remember correctly,
kind of a technicality, yeah.
Well, and if I remember correctly, the whole thing with the law, the way that works, is that they have written a law that basically, as you said, empowers the governor to go after any and all federal dollars in regard to Medicare.
And right.
Medicaid. Sorry, yes, I knew I was doing that wrong. Medicaid dollars. And the problem there, though, is that our state constitution specifically outlines that I guess this is a kind of a technical argument, but I can't remember. It's two sections back to back that basically say that the General Assembly is not allowed to give up their power to the governor. That they have to. There's a separation of powers that exists for a reason, and so that
27 and 28.
The governor. Yes, Section 27 and 28. That even if the General Assembly wanted to say, you know what, Governor, you just take this on. You just do it. That's all good. You just take care of it. That they don't have the constitutional authority to do that. They cannot just do that without changing our Constitution.
Right. And one way of looking at that is that the legislature going beyond the bounds of constitutional Republican principles to give their power away. It's not their power to give away. It belongs to the people, and that is guaranteed under Section 2 of the Kentucky Constitution, which forbids the existence of absolute and arbitrary power, and arbitrarily giving their powers away to the executive branch or to the executive just flies in the face of what we're about.
And Section 2 is by far my favorite section of our Constitution, that the absolute and arbitrary power over the lives, liberty, and property of free men exists nowhere in a republic, even in the greatest majority. I love that section because it really is, at its core, what a republic is supposed to be about, protecting the minority against the majority. And
that is unique language unique to the Kentucky Constitution. Actually, Tennessee has something kind of close, but Kentucky's prohibition of absolute and arbitrary government is the clearest such provision among constitutions anywhere. I mean, there's really not anything like that exactly in the U.S. Constitution either.
And what's interesting about that is that in our Constitution, a little bit further along, it specifically, because that's part of Kentucky's Bill of Rights, it specifically actually says that even just amending or adding on to the Constitution elsewhere cannot invalidate the Kentucky Bill of Rights. So even if there was a constitutional amendment that said, yeah, except when we want to, right? I mean,
right.
For whatever reason.
That's a great point.
They would not be able. Yeah, they cannot do that without, I guess, technically speaking, they might be able to amend the Bill of Rights themselves, but they would not be able to simply add on and say, oh, well, we added this later, in a typical amendment process, right? The later amendment trumps the earlier amendment. But in this scenario, because of the way that our Constitution is built, even if they added a new section to the Constitution somewhere along the way, as long as it's not incorporated into the Bill of Rights specifically, even that is trumped by the Bill of Rights.
Yes.
So that's Our Constitution is a kind of an unwieldy beast, and there's a lot of stuff in it. But the Bill of Rights is definitely, for those who haven't through the Kentucky Bill of Rights, take a moment, go to LRC, which is lrc.ky.gov, and click under Kentucky Law and Kentucky Constitution, and take a look at that, because our Bill of Rights is actually pretty darn strong. I would say that it is stronger than the federal Constitution.
It's very brief. It'll take you 5 minutes. But well worth your time.
Right. Yeah. And
I'm glad you brought that up.
Well, and then you go back through and you think about all the laws, and that's the funny part. As you read through it, you're like, if you cross over and you apply what's happening today at a state or local level, and you say, wait a second, doesn't that technically violate that? It is important, and I unfortunately have heard that many of our legislators just ignore the fact that the Constitution exists. They don't even use the document. And I think that that's very dangerous, because at the end of the day, the only thing really protecting our rights as citizens is our Constitution that, per the federal Constitution requiring us to have a Republican form of government. Our Constitution is what outlines that Republican form of government. And if you ignore the Constitution, then do we even have a Republican form of government at all?
That's a great point. In a budget hearing, it was either 2 years ago or 4 years ago, my state representative, Bob Dameron, was sitting there and making some argument, and actually it was David Williams, of all people, who said, well, Bob, that's unconstitutional. We can't do that. And Bob said, well, it's only unconstitutional if somebody challenges it. And that goes to your point. He said that on camera, that should be so abhorrent that whether you're a Democrat or Republican or whatever, that should be the end of someone's political career, no matter what else you say or what else you think or do.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of like, robbing banks is only illegal if you get caught, is kind of like what he was saying there. And that's a very bad precedent to be setting as well. I mean, we have these rules, we have these laws, and certainly there are laws that I disagree with. But the solution is not just to break the laws. We have a process in place, and so long as that process is there, it should be followed. If you don't like the process, then you work to change that process. But you don't just ignore the process. You don't just ignore the law. You don't just say, whatever, I'm going to do what I want. Because at that point, there is no constitutional republic at that point. If everybody's in a free-for-all, and laws are subjectively applied, or even worse, if it's something where, it's illegal for this class of people, but not for this class of people, you're setting up some really bad precedents over the long term that in the end, whether you're the winner initially or not, you will end up on the wrong end of that at some point. And I think that's really the key, is that you may be for Obamacare, you may be for the exchange, you may be for the Medicaid expansion, and that's great. But ends don't justify means. And creating that legal precedent, I guarantee it will at some point in the future be used against you if that precedent is allowed to stand.
Yeah, and that's the point that I've tried to make to my Democratic friends repeatedly over this last year, that just because you can ram something through now, you'd best not do it, because we might have majorities and a governor here in a couple of years, and how excited will you be for us to use your actions as precedent and say, we don't have to wait for you guys for anything.
Right, and I think that's the most important thing people have to realize, is that it's not even, yes, you can be against Obamacare, you can be against the Medicaid expansion, or you can be for Medicaid expansion, or for the exchange, but it absolutely has to be understood that your party is not always the one in control. Your political desires are not always the train that the state is on. And if you allow this to go, and I have some serious concerns, David, that the state Supreme Court may just go the other way and try to weasel out of this thing.
Sure.
It's going to set a very dangerous precedent.
Well, obviously that's part of the equation. The state Supreme Court justices are politicians. They each serve 4-year terms and are subject to being voted out. When they come up for re-election, and so I'm counting on them to be able to look in their districts. They're all elected geographically in 7 Supreme Court districts across the state, and in 4, if not 5 of those, it's going to be really bad for that politician judge to be labeled as, oh, well, that's one of the Obamacare judges. And so that's where I think that it's a strong likelihood that we're going to get a fair hearing, and a fair hearing and a clear reading of the law works very strongly to my advantage. But sure, it could work the other way, and in which case we have what they're going to have to do, and this is another thing I think is my saving grace, but would also be the paper trail that's being created here by fighting this. Even if it's just fighting it and we do lose, they're going to have a Supreme Court majority decision that writes that KRS 12.028, temporary reorganization statute, really doesn't mean anything. In fact, the whole rule of law thing that we've been playing with for the last 200 years or so doesn't really mean anything, and that when the governor wants to when he wants to make a new law, he just writes it down. And I don't think, but if we are, that'll be a great rallying point for turning things back around.
Well, David, I thank you very much for coming on the show. I don't know if you want to stay on for the second half. We usually invite people to call in and ask questions during the second half, but I want to be respectful of your time, too. Do you have time to hold on through the break?
Yeah, let's. Do you have any callers now?
We don't have any yet, but we also haven't told anybody to call. And then also we have the co-host, Dave, joins in during the second half as well. So if you can hang on through the break,
okay.
We'll get Dave's input. And and then for those of you listening, if you'd like to call in, now's the time. Call in at area code 858-683-1326. Again, 858-683-1326. And we'll be right back, folks. You are listening to Liberty Unbridled on the My View Matters Radio Network. Stay tuned.
First impressions aren't the most important thing. They're the only thing. At Ernie's Print Shop, we'll produce what you need to represent your company professionally. Right now, you can get 1,000 full-color business cards, 1,000 4x6 postcards, or a 3x5 banner for just $60. You choose. Check us out at Ernie'sPrintShop.com. Ernie's Print Shop. Over 50 years, one source, one solution. Ernie'sPrintShop.com. 502-969-8585.
One distance ignored. Piss off the passenger. Answer the wrong door and pick up the phone. No answers left when you're dead. Fly through the fast lane, run from the killer. The world's gone haywire. Communication lost in the damage. The world's gone Fly through the fast lane, run from the killer. The world's gone haywire. Communication lost in the damage. The world's gone haywire. Accusation, who can we blame? Based on confusion, the system goes on. The world's gone
Being a victim of crime is no joke, but you do have options that can help you avoid becoming a victim. I'm Ed Springston of the My View Matters radio show, and on behalf of myself and co-host Ed Martin, I urge each of you to help us fight against crime. You can do your part by calling Crime Stoppers at 582-CLUE. Since 1982, Crime Stoppers has helped get over 23,000 criminals off the street with your help. Working together, we can make a difference to take our streets back. Please call Crime Stoppers at 582-CLUE, or you can visit them online at www.582clue.com. Remember, Crime Stoppers always offers up to a $1,000 reward. Get involved and help make a positive change in your neighborhood. Thanks.
Advertisers, here's a great way to reach a quality audience. Get heard on My View Matters and make some noise in the marketplace.
Email myviewmatters@aol.com for advertising opportunities. Make a sound investment.
All right, folks, and we're back. You are listening to Liberty Unbridled on the My View Matters radio network. And we invite you now to call in 858-683-1326 if you have a question for our guest, David Adams. And I'm going to bring David back on here. David, thank you for holding through the break. And our co-host, Dave, I believe, would like to chime in here as well. So, actually, I'll let Dave, you coming on? There you are.
Hello. I'm here. My voice is all messed up, but I'm here.
We can hear you just fine.
All right, good deal. Well, first things first, we have a lot of listeners, Ken, that are very interested in something, so this is off subject, but because out of respect for our listeners, just a few minutes ago, you UK fans, UK played Michigan today, and they won 75-72. UK is headed to the Final Four, and they play Wisconsin on Saturday in Texas. Just an update.
Yeah, and if I remember right, a particular U.S. Senate candidate has Wisconsin or UK losing to Wisconsin in their bracket, but that's another story entirely.
Nice. So, David, I've got a question for you.
Okay, shoot.
I'm curious if you know that Obamacare is this big, huge monstrosity that even the experts don't seem to understand. You seem to have a more firm grasp on it than just about anybody else that I've talked to or listened to. And so the question that I have is about the many, 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 many people that fall into the bracket of being required to have health insurance and being fined if they do not, but not qualifying for Medicaid. And of course, that the people that fall into that bracket were that whole bracket increased exponentially. For example, what happened with us when the Supreme Court case happened and it was ruled on. My family's policy, we had a private health insurance policy for myself, my wife, and my 2 kids. And our policy was up for renewal the month following that court decision. And the month following that court decision, when our policy was up for renewal, our premiums tripled.
Right. Saw a lot of that.
And so my question for you is, could you please, and I think I kind of already know, but could you please tell the many listeners in Kentucky that are now in that bracket where they're required to have insurance by the 31st of this month, or they'll be fined next year when they do their taxes, but they don't qualify for Medicaid? Could you just tell us a little bit about what happens to those people?
Well, the idea is that they're supposed to suck it up, and pay for the Obamacare insurance that has these standard mandates. And what has happened is as the companies were putting together, the insurance companies were putting together their policies for the Obamacare exchanges, is they figured out the best way to lower rates. Is that they were coming up with astronomical numbers that the premiums were so absurd that they made them a little less absurd by making the provider networks much narrower, and so just taking your doctor away. So if you like your health insurance plan, you can keep your health insurance plan. Barack guarantees it. It also guarantees that if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor, and that's out the window as well. Almost definition, just because the insurance companies are trying to keep their costs down, and the best way to keep their costs down is to not pay claims. So if you're going out of state, your Obamacare policy is not going to pay for it. So you got to stay home, and you got to go to the doctor that they want you to go to, and that doctor has to, it has to stay that way. That doctor has to stay happy, or if he drops off, then you're just out of luck. And we're seeing a lot of that. We're seeing a lot of confusion going forward. And so I'm kind of answering your question in a roundabout way, and just I don't have a lot of hope to offer anybody with regard to activating a health insurance policy within the system and hoping that just works out really well, because they really have destroyed the health insurance market in one fell swoop, creation of Obamacare. So yeah, the best thing to do if you're struggling with how to survive in the era of Obamacare is talk to anybody that you've elected to anything and tell them to get you the heck out of it. To repeal it, to defund it, to stop operating it, to make it go away, and the solution. And so the Democrats like to come back with is, oh yeah, well you guys don't have an alternative on the other side. Well, the alternative on the other side is no government involvement at all, and that's an ideal, and we need to push towards that. But the less government involvement we have in healthcare, the better.
And David, is that in fact what we would have if either one of your court cases succeeded?
No. In fact, my court cases are challenging and inside the law. Nothing that I would do would actually do away with Obamacare, except expansion go away. we have a very perverse situation with regard to Medicaid under Obamacare for states that opt into the Medicaid expansion. Because if you, and in fact it works either way, whether your state has opted into Medicaid expansion or not, if you qualify for Medicaid, for expanded Medicaid, whether your state offers it or not, you don't qualify for subsidies, for the subsidies to buy private insurance. And in fact, if you qualify for Medicaid and you're in a state where you qualify, you just qualify for whatever the Medicaid standard is in that state, it's illegal for you to buy private insurance. It's also illegal for you to go to the doctor and just pay cash. So you're really, the worst thing that can happen is that you wind up in Medicaid. Unless, for people who absolutely can't take care of themselves and are in absolute dire straits, and that's not likely to change. Of course, that's at least the original intent. That's why Medicaid is there. But what I've heard from the people working inside the exchanges, the most frequently asked question that they get is, what income do I need to put down on this piece of paper in order to qualify for Medicaid? I mean, so, which should be pretty shocking if you think about that at all. But, people are just going for the free stuff, which is a terrible, terrible idea. And if you're, for whatever reason, you find yourself in a low-income situation and could be given the Medicaid, and you have a libertarian bone in your body, I would say don't talk to the connectors, don't sign up for it, don't even go on the website, much less put any personal information in there. Run away from that thing because it's a trap, and it's a really nasty, pernicious trap that you don't want any part of, because if you wind up sick and really needing some help, you're at the mercy of the state.
One of the things that I've been curious about, and I don't know that you're going to have an answer to this. I think it's something that just needs to be thought about. Nobody is talking about. One of the big pushes is to increase the minimum wage. And if the minimum wage is increased, I believe they will end up re-indexing the poverty line. And I know that the Medicaid expansion had to do with increasing the percentage at the poverty line of people who qualify. So I don't know what it used to be, but I think we're at 130% of poverty level is who qualifies for Medicaid now. Is that correct, David? Do you know?
135 to 138.
Okay.
What they're raising it to under Medicaid expansion, and there's another project that's actually part of the Affordable Care Act that just hasn't been implemented very widely yet. I think California is pretty close to having this all rolled out, and Kentucky's looking at the beginning of 2015 to roll out what are called bridge plans that would allow Medicaid to go to people up to 250% of poverty. So
wow.
they're eventually trying to put everybody on Medicaid.
And that's exactly where I was going with this. And especially then if they re-index the poverty line, right, to something higher, which I would presume would happen after they raise minimum wage, one way or the other, whether that's automatic or the fact that that everyone's cost of living will go up anyway because the minimum wage goes up, that we're going to end up with an ever-increasing percentage of people who qualify by doing that. And, I think, if I remember right, the average household income is about $45,000 a year. And if I remember right, poverty level is $20,000, I think, somewhere around there. So at 250%, you're talking $50,000 a year, if that's the correct line. So that's already encompassing, the average household and then some, and all the way down the rest of the ranks.
Right. Yeah, and it's clear that is the intention, that's where we're headed. and that it's an interesting example that you brought up. I hadn't thought about that precisely, but certain at this point that that is part of the equation. It's kind of bracket creep in reverse.
Right. And I guess my concern there, my real concern with all of this is that when you go into Medicaid, you're going to end up in these one-size-fits-all type plans, and everyone knows that one size does not fit all, that individuals have individual health needs, and what's good for one might not be good for another. And on top of the fact that, government is not exactly known for its efficiency. And I have to worry that, what we're seeing here is an ever-increasing government insurance market through Medicaid that will, in the end, actually net cost more because the government is not efficient at doing these sorts of things, and especially not efficient at dealing with individual issues. And when, especially in healthcare, we hear the stories about the abuse that's out there already, people that are abusing the system, and for that matter, medical providers who are abusing the system and putting in bogus claims to Medicare and Medicaid. And
right, and it's
I
not
have to
just
worry.
in the end. It's a near-term problem. We're experiencing problems with that are immediate. We don't have to wait for it to go bad.
What I worry, though, is that by expanding the system and making it even bigger, that we're actually going to see even more of these types of issues, right? We haven't, quote-unquote, fixed the system as it is, and now we're talking about doubling the system or almost tripling the size of the system, or roughly thereabouts, and it seems like that's only going to encourage further abuse rather than actually solve anything.
Sure, and in fact, there's a recently touted statistic. Governor Beshear is saying that 75% of the people who have signed up for Medicaid under the expansion did not have insurance prior to signing up for Medicaid under the expansion, and that means, which I would be willing to bet. I mean, you're having a real hard time getting true statistics out of Pravda, the state-sponsored media, or the mouthpiece of the Beshear administration. But even if that's accurate, that it's 75% of the new Medicaid people were previously uninsured, that means that you have 25% of the people signing up for Medicaid that didn't need Medicaid. They had private insurance to begin with, and so they were canceled off of or enticed to drop their coverage to go on to Medicaid, and that's very clearly moving in the wrong direction, where you're taking people. It's one thing to go out and find people who need help and want help and give it to them on a temporary basis to help them get back on their feet. But to take people who were taking care of themselves and to put them in a position of dependency, that sure ain't what made America great.
No, and you mentioned that, and that's one thing I was watching earlier today, the UConn Michigan State game, and there's LeBron James advertising for the exchange. And it got me thinking, it's awfully strange. I've never, ever in my life seen a government program advertise so hard and so heavy on TV. I mean, I seems like there may have been a program once or twice that maybe ran an ad or something like that. But, even things like Kentucky Proud, right? I mean, they ran a couple of ads a couple of times, but, whatever. But, I mean, as the deadline has approached for signing up for Obamacare, there's been almost this frenzy of advertising trying to get people to sign up. And it's been hot and heavy, and it's kind of interesting to see how much, and I'd really be interested to find out how much they've spent in advertising dollars trying to promote a government program. And I have to wonder if that's really the right role.
That's a great point and a great question, and my answer is you'll never know because the sycophantic media coverage has been so over the top, so obscene in its tone about hurry, get your Obamacare. It's so great, and everybody loves it so much. And this is on the news page. This is in newsprint on a news page under a byline and a headline with a picture. It looks like a news story, but if there's not, that's a payola scandal begging to be uncovered. And I'm surprised, I guess I won't be terribly surprised if at some point some disillusioned journalist comes out and says, well, we were under orders, and our editors or our publisher was being paid so many millions of dollars to force us to write this crap.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I mean, we already have evidence that has happened in part, and while certainly not a mainstream outlet, I saw a story, and we mentioned it a few shows ago, about The Onion was hired by the Department of Health and Human Services to write articles in favor of Obamacare. And I'm like, well, wait a second. First of all, that's kind of just absolutely silly anyway, and what a waste of money to use a parody newspaper to write about your thing, although maybe appropriate. But we are seeing that media outlets have been being paid. And David, and I know, we've been around politics long enough to know that certainly media outlets are friendlier to people who are buying advertising from them. And so I think that that's a big part of this, that the large amount of dollars being spent by the Department of Health and Human Services to advertise for Obamacare actually works to inherently quell any sort of dissent from the part of the media and really getting the full information out there. And that gets to a broader conversation about the broken media and what's wrong with it. But I don't think that I don't believe that the Department of Health and Human Services doesn't know that has that effect, that by pushing the advertising and pushing that advertising dollar down to the media outlets, that I have to believe that they know the game, and they know that helps quell any sort of dissension on the issue.
Yeah, I would be a little bit more, just add a layer of cynicism on top of that, which I believe that you share, that not only is it just a happy circumstance, but it's a very clearly implemented strategy.
Yeah, there's been a lot of marketing involved in this, and I'd be remiss not to mention this because it came out last week, and I thought it was hilarious. Did you see the Pelosi's daughter came out with this "Don't tread on my Obamacare" silliness? Did you see this?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, I mean, and I've got the polls here to show it. It's really entertaining. There is since the passage of the law, there's not been popular support for the law. The Real Clear Politics average right now is running 13.5 points in favor of opposing the law. And while proponents will say, well, that also includes people who just want something different. They didn't think it went far enough. That percentage must be pretty small, because the polls that have been run that show the number of people who actually want to go back to the old system is running around 60%. And so that's a pretty high margin of people who would rather go back to the way it was. And as you mentioned earlier, the real problem is that the damage has been done. And it's going to be really hard to go back at this point. I mean, it's going to take time for the market to correct. Go ahead.
There's a larger point about that really has to be driven home, that a lot of people, I see Republican politicians on the national scale get stumped by this every day when some liberal talking head says, well, what's your alternative? What would you do? And going back to the were in 2007, say, or even 1997 or 87 or 77 or 67. Just going back to those points in time misses the point that we, many decades ago, at least in the mid-'60s, with the creation of Medicare and Medicaid, when government very dramatically expanded its role in healthcare in America, we have very systematically, over a long period of time, destroyed our healthcare system. Prior to Obamacare, with the rapid expansion of government's role in healthcare, Obamacare merely put the process on fast forward. And so going back to a point in time, 5 years ago or even a decade or 2 decades ago, doesn't come close to solving the problem, because we're not properly identifying the problem, which is government involvement. Every Department of Insurance, every state Department of Insurance in the country, because actually, I believe that, and I've told this to them to their faces. I'm not worried about it. I believe that the Kentucky Department of Insurance is run by evil people with very, very bad intent. They have no intention of properly serving the public or protecting consumers in any way, shape, or form, and it's almost purely accident when they do ever serve serve the public in any meaningful fashion. But that said, Kentucky has one of the best track records of any state Department of Insurance in the country for management of a healthcare system and for health insurance rather, and that is a very, very sad state of affairs, because we have been abysmal. If you simply let anybody who wanted to be a health insurance company write up a health insurance policy and go out and try to sell it, and allowed and did away with any kind of government control or regulation of that process, and just had lawsuits when somebody got cheated, that process would be infinitely more advantageous to consumers and producers and providers of every stripe, all the way across the board.
Well, David, I certainly appreciate you coming on the show, and I agree with you on that. But we're here in the last few seconds. Is there any websites or anything you want to plug here in the last few seconds of the show?
Yeah, I do daily updates on my blog on Kentucky Progress. You can find it at kyprogress.com, or Google me, David Adams, and we'll keep you up to date on what's happening with the legal effort, what's happening with regard to Obamacare, and then the other issues I'm fighting on as well.
All right. Well, David, thank you very, very much for coming on the show. I think it's been great, and I hope our listeners really enjoyed it. I think they will. So, again, David Adams, thank you very, very much, and definitely stay in touch as things move along in your lawsuits. We would definitely want to know what's going on.
Thanks, guys.
And, folks, we are actually over a minute here, so we're going to wrap it up. Folks, I want to thank you for tuning in to another edition of Liberty Unbridled on the My View Matters Radio Network. Tune in again next week, 7 o'clock Eastern Time. Every Sunday we're here. And tune in to the other shows on the network as well, Monday through Thursday, 7 o'clock. Until then, folks, have a good week, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks.